So good morning again. I think I'll get started here. I'm sure some people will still be coming in, but it's a good moment to start. Thank you very much all for joining. So again, my name is Marc-Olivier from the Department of Chemical Engineering at UCL, and I'm really happy to share some of my passion actually today with you on nature-inspired chemical engineering, lessons we can learn from nature to design new processes, new materials, solve some of our challenging problems. And this is also a module that I'm teaching at UCL to fourth-year chemical engineering students and MSc students. So thank you and congratulations to all of you offer holders. So you get a bit of a sense of one of our classes that we're teaching at UCL. Now, some of you may have heard my previous lecture that I gave exactly 1 month ago on this topic. And so others may not. And so this is why I present a bit of a mix so that also people who have not yet heard any of this material get a sense of what nature-inspired chemical engineering is. Why are we doing this? How could it solve these problems? What is the methodology behind nature-inspired chemical engineering? And but I'll also give some new examples as well, so that people who have heard my lecture before get a sense of some of the other examples, and also based on some questions I received last time. For example, around membranes and water and coatings and examples like this. So let's get ahead. So why are we looking at nature-inspired chemical engineering? Well, the point is that when we think about problems, challenging problems, there are quite a few of them. I mean, we're living in a crisis right now and health is one of them. But when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, clearly challenges are much broader than that. And some of them revolve around social issues, economical issues, energy issues, climate, and so forth. There's also another way of looking at challenges, which is from an industrial perspective. And so, for example, in the UK, we have an industrial strategy document, and there you see concepts like clean growth and the future of mobility, aging, AI, data economy. And so there are various ways, of course, to look at these different types of challenges, and they're all very large ones. Hence, we call them grand challenges. In fact, that's a term that's been introduced by several academies of engineering. First, the US National Academy of Engineering. And then there was a meeting in 2013 between the UK Royal Academy of Engineering, the Chinese Academy, and the US National Academy here in London. I was attending this, and this was also a place where grand challenges grants were being announced also by the EPSRC, and we were lucky to get one exactly around nature-inspired engineering. And I'll tell you in a minute why. So actually last year, there was another one of these meetings, and every time what we come back with is that the issue is still there, because a number of these challenges are very, very large, and what it requires to address them is to rethink problems, to think outside of the box. We can't think just in terms of narrow disciplines. It's important to collaborate between people, think differently, do things differently, but also understand the context of the problem to be effective. I mean, a way to apply a certain problem, whether it is, say, in Africa or in China or in the UK, may be quite different. There's also a need to be able to want to take risks, but then to do it also in a responsible way. So responsible innovation needs to be cultivated as well. Finally, some of these grand challenges, there are a number of changes that one do as a chemical engineer also in a process that are more incremental and can have tremendous economic benefits. However, when we think about problems around, say, climate change and water and larger issues around health, we really need transformative changes. We need things that are very, very different. And so at UCL, we also have one of our 6 grand challenges is the one on transformative technology, which I chair together with a colleague in the social sciences. And this really thinks more broadly at how innovation and technology can have far-reaching benefits for society and the planet. Because in the end of the day, as engineers, we try to solve problems for society. So, you know, you're interested in chemical engineering. So when we look at a chemical plant today, we see this picture here on the right. But then we'll look at a picture here on the left, which is actually a copy from a book from the 16th century. And you wonder, well, what has really changed here? I mean, these are still tanks which are in series with stirrers in them. And yeah, they may have been made out of different materials. They're made out of wood on the left, and maybe they'll be made out of metals and different types of special alloys on the right. And the design will have involved computers and so forth. but actually the way of thinking, has it really changed? And so the angle we want to take here is to try to think differently, to answer what I just explained you around grand challenges, and to say, can we perhaps innovate by drawing lessons from nature, which has had a chance to evolve over eons? And so that heads to the Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering. And I'll tell you now why this is the case. So when we look at nature, there's an underlying architecture, structure, and a dynamics of nature. And there are a number of desirable properties that are associated with that. One is the scalability of the architecture you see in nature. And this goes from the way that DNA is folded within the nucleus of a cell, the structure of cells themselves, organs, and entire organism. In all of these, you have this hierarchical structure with transport across length scales, which is linked to reaction processes at a molecular level. And so this leads to so-called process intensification. So this very intimate connection of separations and reaction processes with very good scalable structures. So another thing we notice in nature is that many of these processes, they don't happen at equilibrium. In fact, equilibrium is like death. You know, life is all about systems far from equilibrium. Things are growing. There are also collective dynamics. And so these collective dynamics, from the network of gene networks to metabolic networks to the way that cells are trying to survive, it's very important that you have a collection between them and interfaces and interactions between that. And that also leads to robustness, to resilience and adaptability. I mean, if you notice this Petri dish on the right with these bacterial communities, there's not enough food for them there, and they try to avoid each other. And so in this way, they're adaptive and they survive as a whole. So I underline the number of terms here because each of these are important, also in chemical engineering and in process engineering. And these type of concepts, we see them in nature. So can we learn something from this? Right, and so I get inspired a lot by systems in nature, and this was the image that we had for the invitation for the lecture. And so there's a walnut tree actually in my garden, and you see these hierarchical structures. So what can we learn from this, right? So I'll give a few examples of how we can learn from this structure to the devices and the materials that you see on this slide. I mean, and as I said, the systems are far from equilibrium. They evolve constantly. This picture was taken a month ago. This is the same tree now. So you see how things evolve dramatically here. It's a nice spring in London. So nature-inspired chemical engineering, or NICE for short, is about learning from this architecture and the dynamics of natural systems at all scales. Help us design, synthesize innovative solutions to technological challenges. And these are related to a number of problems that interest us as engineers around resource efficiency, energy, water, materials, but also health, around living environments, systems, and so forth. But what is key in this is that we need some mechanistic understanding. We can't just imitate nature. We can't imitate out of context. The objectives that may be there in nature and the environment are very different from the ones that we have as engineers when we design a chemical plant or in society. There's a social context. There's an economic context. The timescales are very different. This tree that I showed, I mean, it's been growing over several decades, and that is quite different from the timescales that may be important to design a process and to build a reactor. And so also the materials that we have access to are very different from nature. Some nature is very intricate, has many, many different types of very complicated and intricate materials, which we can actually learn from. But on the other hand, we can also design some very new materials, and we have new manufacturing methods. So it's very important to not go and resort to biomimicry in a narrow sense, but to learn from mechanistic principles. And that's what this talk is really going to be about, to show you how we go about doing this and to give you a few examples. So we'll actually look at a tree as a chemical reactor, right? So I'm showing you an image of a tree. Clearly you see this tree crown, and you also see the leaves that grew on there. And so at the smallest scale, at the nanoscale, you have a very intricate complex related to molecular complexes that lead to photosynthesis and the conversion of the CO2 and the water with sunlight into the sugars and the material that grows the tree. And so there is a clear parallel between the structure of the tree and the one of catalytic reactors. Because if you look at the tree as a whole, it's like a chemical reactor that is growing, right? But it can only grow thanks to the fact that you have nutrients, water that can access the tips of the twigs in this tree and then the leaves in this tree. Now, these complexes are similar to the active sites in catalysts. The active sites in the catalyst are where molecules are being converted reactants into products selectively, into those that you want to form. But then molecules need to access those sites, products need to be removed. So the structure of the architecture of these of the transport networks is very important. And you also see this in the structure of the leaf, which is different from the one of the tree crown, and is similar to ones you see in a porous catalyst particle with its pore network. So through which you can have these molecular transport in and out. So you clearly have this hierarchical structure, and all these scales are important, and they're very well connected to each other and link transport and reaction. Now, inspiration from trees is something that architects have been doing for centuries, right? And so this is an example of inspiration from a tree of the Gardens by the Bay in Singapore, but it's more of copying the structure of the tree. There is no actual use of them. Whether you like it or not is a question of aesthetics, but actually it's more a structure in terms of aesthetics than functionality, like I just described in this tree, some of the properties. Well, when you look at this example from Gaudí, from the famous Sacred Family Church in Barcelona, there 100 years ago, Gaudí already had inspiration from trees in what he called organic architecture, but he used also the mechanical properties, not just the aesthetics, right, which he integrated. And so the mechanical properties are there, that this hierarchy of structures that you have in a tree crown, you use this and this in a type of balancing of forces to be able to support the dome of the cathedral. And so in this way, you have distributed forces that can carry a large weight. So this is using some mechanical ideas, not just mimicking nature directly. Right? Let's give another example here from the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Right? These are two of the famous engineers of that time, William Fairbairn and Robert Stephenson. And on the image on the right, which is in the Institute of Civil Engineers, you see a famous bridge in the back, right? And this is this bridge over the Menai Strait. So this is from the Victorian age, so 150 years ago. Now, there was a project to build a bridge to cross this deep strait and very treacherous waters in Wales. I got this image from my colleague, Asteris Gavrilidis, a professor in our department, and it's based on a documentary that was shown on Channel 5 here in the UK. Now, the idea that these engineers got actually was from the structure of reeds. The fact is that they needed to have these bridges which can carry very heavy trains to transport goods. And so these locomotives, these engines were extremely heavy. And so many bridges would collapse easily. And so the idea they had is, what can we learn actually of the fact that you have these plants and reeds? They are actually hollow. So it's not that you just use more materials that it's stronger. These hollow materials also lead to the fact that they are flexible, like reeds can move in the wind. And that's very important when you're constructing a bridge. There will be vibrations. There will be vibrations also from the trains that roll over them. And so talking about rolling over them, well, the brilliant idea that Robert Stephenson and William Fairbairn had was that the train would run through actually the structure, not just on top of it. So they had this hollow box girder technology. And so you use a minimum of material, you have the train that's rolling through, so you less material, it's stronger, and it also is more resistant to all the vibrations of the trains going across. Now note, this is not narrow biomimicry. They didn't have exactly the same structure, exactly the same shape. And it took a lot of ingenuity to construct this. And what they also implemented was new materials. Before that, in the past, you had wood and then stone and then cast iron. And cast iron is very brittle. So here they used wrought iron. And that's been very important also in chemical engineering. Some of the processes being developed and designed by chemical engineers were only possible thanks to the advance of new materials of construction, right? They can resist the higher temperatures, pressures, different chemical environments. And so it's important to integrate elements of new construction, new materials, new insight, and combine this with the inspiration you get from nature. So this to me is a really beautiful example of nature-inspired engineering. So to come back over our definition of nature-inspired chemical engineering, right? We're learning from this architecture, also dynamics, to help synthesize solutions. It's all about mechanistic understanding in nature and not imitating out of context. But still, I haven't told you how we do this. We need really a methodology. And that's what I call nature-inspired solutions for engineering. And I'll just illustrate with some examples. So the basis for this is that when we look at nature, we can look in various ways. Of course, we can look at the aesthetics, but from a point of view of a scientist, we could look at properties that are really unique, like in this little creature, the tardigrade. and that's studied by biologists. Now, this little creature is a microscopic creature. It can live at the bottom of the sea. It can live on top of mountains. It will still survive. You can even put it in space and it will survive. You can put it in liquid nitrogen and defreeze it, and it will still be able to reproduce even many years later. So clearly there's a lot to be learned of the properties of this creature. I mean, the exceptional properties and the fact it's concrete. And so that's the territory of biology, which doesn't mean we cannot use the other sciences to understand this, but it's very much of a biological topic. Now, another way of looking at nature is not just looking at uniqueness, but universality. And that's the territory of physics. So it's looking at abstract properties. So what we see in all these structures on the dunes, the beaches, or the clouds is regular patterns. And so the question then is, where do these regular patterns come from? How did they arise? Why are they all similar? And so that's the laws of physics that help you resolve that. So this universality, one of these properties is the one we saw in the tree I showed earlier. You have this similar type of architecture you see in the vascular network of a liver or in the structure of the lungs. And so it was Benoit Mandelbrot, who was actually a mentor for me, who wrote this book, The Fractal Geometry of Nature, where he discovered that there is an underlying common symmetry in many structures in nature, which is that when you zoom in to details of them, you see similar features as in larger scales. And that's what he called fractal structures. And so this is an example of self-similar fractals. It's an internal symmetry that allows us to simplify these structures. And we see them everywhere. I mean, again, you know, since we are looking in the garden, you see these plants. I took these pictures of the plants just a few days ago, and you see them grow. And in this particular plant, you see on the top, you see 6 levels of self-similarity in them. And then you see another level that arises when these flowers start to bloom and scent. And also ferns are typical examples of fractals with this hierarchical structure, similar at multiple scales. And that actually simplifies the structure. They look complicated, but they're not. They're complex. And so that simplifies it. Same in some vegetables. I mean, these are some broccolis and cauliflowers and broccolinis and romanesco. And so they all have this beautiful self-similar structure. So what is this methodology then that we use for NICE? Well, the point is that at the same time, we want this methodology to be practical, to solve really challenging engineering problems. That's where we started off today. It needs to be enabling. It needs to be a pathway to innovate. But also, we wanted it to be thematic. And that's how we've constructed the Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering, on the basis of universal physical principles behind desirable properties and based on mechanisms. And these mechanisms are related to these themes. So I'll show you now what these are. So these fundamental mechanisms, there's one we've talked about quite a bit already, are these hierarchical transport networks you see in trees and in lungs and in leaves. A second one, though, is the balancing of forces, and not just in mechanics, like you saw in the example of the bridge, but also at the nanoscale. For example, chaperones and how they help fold proteins. There's the protein complexes. It's not just at that scale, the nanoscale, right? Close to molecular scale. It is not just size effects, but also electrostatics, physical chemical interaction that are important. And there's a subtle balance between them that allows some processes to be very, very active or very selective. And then there's the dimension of time, of dynamic self-organization, which you see of the pattern formation on these beaches, for example, due to the action of the wind or the action of the water, that you get very regular structures, right? And so we received this Frontier Engineering Award in 2013 at that Grand Challenges event that I mentioned at the beginning, which allowed us to start a Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering. And soon after this, I started to teach also a class on nature-inspired chemical engineering around this concept, and where students actually work on some of these examples that I will show in teams, working between different students to develop a project that they choose of themselves, and to learn from nature to solve a particular problem, and using the methodology that I'll now describe. So last year we were fortunate enough to receive another grant from the EPSRC, and that allows us to look at a new theme around learning from systems in nature, the ecosystems we see, the networks we see in nature, the modularity we see in nature. And this type of structures you see in nature and systems behavior is behind a lot of the resilience you see and adaptability. So there's a lot to be learned from this. I mean, think about the current crisis and health crisis and the unfortunate network of viral expansion, and also the supply chains and the difficulty to get goods where they need to be. I think there's a lot to be learned from nature to actually start addressing some of these issues. So I talked to you about some of these first principles, so mechanistic, thematic, enabling, and practical, but also in order to do something, how can we get from nature and this inspiration we have to solve a particular problem, an application in its context in practice? Well, we need a method that is systematic, a design methodology. And that's what we developed within the Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering. And that's the subject of the course, the NICE course at UCL. So at first we derive a particular concept. So it's an abstraction of the structure we see in nature, like this hierarchical structure you see of the tree. Then you use this to apply in a certain design to solve a problem, say in scalability of chemical reactors. So we are driven by a problem in chemical engineering, like the fact that we say, well, you know, you look at this chemical plant, you look at one in the 16th century and they mix in the same way. Can't we do this better? Can we learn something from trees which distribute fluids in a very uniform way from the micro to the macro level and do this in a scalable way? So that allows us to go from the concept in nature to particular design, and I'll explain this of how we did that, to building prototypes and to apply them. And so to do this, you need to think about the context. So it needs to be contextual, and we need a robust methodology that's also versatile. And again, I'll give you examples to show you what I mean with that. So let's give some examples of this. So I'll start with some on these hierarchical transport networks before moving to some other ones related to force balancing. I might go a little quicker over this first example, because those that are interested can look in more detail at some of the examples I gave in my previous lecture, which is on the YouTube channel of UCL Chemical Engineering. So when we look at a chemical reactor, as I said, there's many scales that are important. And I already said what catalysts are to selectively convert reactants into products, selective products, without being converted themselves. Now, this revolves around phenomena at the nanoscale. So you have many ranges of scale to cover, from the catalyst pores to the catalyst particles that are porous materials to how these are stacked in the reactor. And so the issues around linking these scales are around transport and distribution problems very often. So you can't just easily, like in the chemical lab, go from these reactants to product distribution. At a small scale, this may work, but on a large scale, there are often problems. So how do you do this? And so when we look at these different scales in a reactor, there's a lot of lessons we can learn from this. So let's look at this macro scale first and look at the structure of these trees and lungs. So our first invention was a fractal injector for multiphase reactors, because the lungs and the trees, which are fractal structures, they very effectively, in a scalable way, link the micro and the macro scale thanks to this self-similarity. So the concept we derive from the lung and the tree is one where you can have one injection point, right, where fluid going in. You see this, for example, on the drawing on the left. And so with this secondary fluid, and then it distributes very uniformly to each of the outlets, the twigs, right? And so you have equal distances and therefore equal flow rates throughout the vessel, rather than having only fluid that goes in through the bottom in a primary flow. And so the picture you see here in the next to it is a photograph of one that's built out of steel that uses these principles. And when you want to scale up this injector, you just build one that has more generations, right? Just like in these plants I showed you, rather than just make it bigger. So the stem is bigger, but it's the number of generations that has changed, and the small scale is exactly the same. And so what happens is that when you put this in a so-called fluidized bed reactor, which is a reactor filled with solid particles, but with gas going through the bottom, so the particles are set in motion. Well, you can see here an example of normal fluidized bed, if you want. So this gas comes through the bottom, and we can visualize these bubbles that are grow, they coalesce, they're very chaotic. And so it's very difficult to scale because they can become bigger and larger reactor. And so the transport is difficult to control. Now, when you use this fractal structure, you see that the bubbles almost disappear, even though you have the same total amount of gas. So the gas is locally mixed at each of these outlets of this tree-like structure with the solid, interact very closely with it. And in this way, you have much more effective, well-controlled reaction. And the result of this is that when you increase the amount of gas that goes through the reactor to try to make a product like the chemical you see here, maleic anhydride, which is the basis of very important polymers used in trucks and in boats and pipes and so forth. And you see that the yield and the selectivity towards this product increases with the amount of gas that's going to the fractal structure rather than just going through the bottom. Selectivity is also important because you make this product out of butane, and butane, if you put it in the context of air at a higher temperature where it will combust, of course, it will form CO2. So you don't want to form the CO2, you want to form this maleic anhydride. And so the selectivity also goes up thanks to the very well controlled injection of this gas at different levels in the reactor and the good contact. Okay, so what we showed here, what I showed here, is that we can go solve a problem related to scaling up fluidized bed for a chemical production by learning from the structure of the lung. Now, how do we get this inspiration? Well, we had to conceptualize, abstract, right? There's a sense of physical abstraction from the lung, this fractal structure, keeping the smallest scale constant, change the number of generations when you scale up, build a design, realize that, and then you see these results, okay? And so in very recent times, we've gone back to this problem, and now we can actually make these structures much more easily by rapid prototyping, by 3D printing. So in the past, a couple of years ago, we had to put them together with different tubes. It's much more complicated. And now, thanks to new manufacturing methods, it's much easier to make it, right? Remember that example I gave you from the Industrial Revolution of the bridge. It's in fact the same way. Ideas not just of taking from nature, but new materials, new methods of construction, and integrating them, right? Also computations we do to understand this. So let's look now at the mesoscale in this reactor here and the catalytic particles. Well, these catalytic particles have a hierarchical structure. So if you only had pores which were nanoscaled, a few nanometers wide, even in a particle of say a few millimeters in diameter, right, it would be very hard for molecules to access where they need to and products to go out. So you get so-called transport limitations, right? It's blockages like in traffic jams, right? And so we call this diffusion limitations because at that small scale, the motion of molecules is governed by the random motion of diffusion rather than pressure-driven flow or convection, right? Which is like in the reactor I showed you. There it's convective flow. So the physics are different. And so the question then arises, what is the optimal structure of this large pore channel network we should put into a nanoporous material to have the best overall effective properties for overall yield, selectivities, and not blocking of these pores, right? And the thing is that in material science, there's been so much progress in chemistry. Material science is an example of materials we can make in our lab of hierarchical zeolites. The pores are only the size of a single molecule, but we can also make the crystals of these materials of any arbitrary size and put in large channels. And so when we go back to nature, I draw my inspiration from the structures of leaves, because in very large leaves, you may have a fractal architecture, but when you put a very narrow at a smaller scale, then you see that these cells are all the same size. And so we have moved from fractal to a uniform structure. So the transport structure seems to move from something fractal to uniform when the transport mechanism moves from flow to diffusion. And so irrespective of this, we did overall computational optimization of these catalyst particles, optimized porosity, large pore sizes. And what we find is indeed, like in nature, that the optimum is not fractal at this level, but it is of uniform large channels and having like cells, crystals of an optimal size, so that at that level, you don't have transport limitations. And so we implemented this, and so you can make all these different materials, as I showed, with larger pores and different sponges of large and narrow pores. And so the question is, what is the best structure? How large should the pores be? How should they be distanced? What is the size? Well, an example here is you have these hierarchical zeolitic structures, this so-called SAPO11, they all have different codes. Depending on the chemistry, we can make very different geometries, right? They look like flakes or like cauliflowers and so forth. You can look in the microscope, right? This is on the left with a scanning electron microscope and then with transmission, and you see the scale bars that go from micrometers to nanometers, right? And you see that we can control these structures and we can get very different structures, even though they're all silicon aluminum phosphates. They're all similar types of materials at the molecular level, if you want, the crystalline unit cell level, okay? And so, but what's interesting is that depending on the geometry at larger scale, the large channels and the architecture of these materials, you get completely different absorption rates of a molecule like normal heptane, for example. So why are we interested in normal heptane? Well, normal heptane, you have it in different oils. And when you want to increase the octane number of a gasoline, you need to isomerize them. And you would like to have isooctane, say, to have a higher octane number, right? And so there's a process called hydroisomerization that does this. And we can use these materials with some noble metal deposited on it. And what you see is, depending on the structure here, you get a completely different uptake rate. And you see the pink line has the highest uptake, but also the amount of these isomers that you can make out of this normal heptane as a function of the temperature, you see this going through maximum. So what's happening here? So at the very low temperature, this reaction is not happening at all. It's very sluggish, right? So the reactions are not going on, temperature is not high enough. It's an activated process, and you need to increase the temperature. But what happens at very high temperature? Well, yes, the reactions are going very fast, but they go so fast that molecules can't access the sites. So it's so-called diffusion limited. And so that's why you have a maximum in between. But we can control this maximum by providing better access. And so the one that has this pink line is the material that's shown here on top, right? Which has these larger pores with an optimal crystal size in between. And so in this case, we can have the highest possible isomer yield. Now, what's interesting is that, similar to natural structures, this happens just at the cusp where diffusion would just start to be limited, right? And so the reactions can take over. So you have a very good matching of diffusion and reaction. If these particles were too large, you get too much traffic jams of the molecules wanting to move out, the products. And when these products want to move out, the valuable products, they start to crack, they start to break down. So you have additional reactions that reduce the overall selectivity. And so there's a maximum in selectivity thanks to the tuning of this material. So again, this is a very concrete example how you learn from nature. Another one is related to fuel cells, right? So in fuel cells is also electrocatalytic phenomenon. But here you have a fuel, hydrogen, that is oxidized with air, oxygen from air. If you do this directly, you would burn the hydrogen, make water, and you are limited by the so-called Carnot efficiency. But if you do this with two electrodes, an anode and a cathode, and a membrane in between, you can form a fuel cell. And in this way, you have an electrochemical process, and you can have a much, much higher intrinsic efficiency, do this at lower temperature. And indeed, you just form water, and you do this electrocatalytically. However, the problem is that these catalysts are expensive. They use noble metals. And the water that's formed in this, there are mass transport limitations. So they have difficulty getting out of the pores and be removed. And so you get stability issues. So even though these fuel cells have been around for a long time, we turn to this and ask ourselves, can we learn something from how can we distribute, say, these fluids better, the oxygen better in particular? Because that's where the main limitations are, where the oxygen has accessing here the cathode and converting protons that move through from the hydrogen here to the electrolyte, and with the oxygen form water, right? So the limitations were on that side. And so we draw inspiration from the lungs because that's an air distributor, right? But it's a very efficient and scalable air distributor that's been evolved over millions of years. And so there's a lot to be learned from that. And so mammalian lungs have this similar structure where you have this fractal hierarchical structure at the top levels where flow is limiting transport. But then at some level, these bronchioles, they become narrower and narrower and narrower. And at some moment, they become so narrow that the pressure drop would become too high and diffusion sets in. And the structure becomes very uniform, like grapes on a vine in the acinus. And that's where you have exchange with the bloodstream. Now, there's a lot one can say about the lung. So it's scalable, right? It's fractal, similar scalable to be able to do this and to grow just like we grow. And at the same time, it's thermodynamically extremely efficient. So the length to diameter ratio of each of these channels is optimized to minimize the amount of energy through breathing. So the thing is, we can learn lessons from this. And that's what we did to build a new fuel cell prototype. The higher levels with a fractal structure, we printed them using rapid prototyping, 3D printing. You see here one in plastic here on the right. So using the same concept, that's the lateral thinking from what we used in that fluidized bed reactor, right, with that fractal injector. But now in a plate, and then it's going to uniformly distribute like a perfect shower head, right, over the catalyst layer below it, which contains the catalyst where you have conversion of the oxygen and the protons to water, and the water could be removed. So, and the catalyst is then more uniformly distributed using the principles we learned before from in porous catalysts. And so we've been building this using computational designs, fluid mechanics. So you see kind of an image of this, and you have an optimal number of generations, just like in the lung. If the number of generations is too high, you're going to have a too high pressure drop and you're not benefiting from anything. Is diffusion is setting in at a certain level, and that dictates the number of generations. And so these plates were not made out of plastic anymore, but out of conducting metal. And so you can see with X-rays, when you go through it, tomography, you can see this nice fractal distribution. You can test if there is no errors in the design. And so when you implement this with respective numbers, increasing numbers of generations, you see on the right how the current density that you can pull from this fuel cell, which when you multiply the current with the potential will give you the power that you get out, is increasing dramatically with the number of branching generations. But when the number of branching generations is too high, it's going to level off because you can't beat diffusion, okay? The diffusion sets in. And so there's some agreement here between experiments and simulations, but also we needed to, the simulations get us higher than the experiments we could have, and I'll get back to that. Why this is the case? It's got to do something with the water that is formed, and I'll explain that. So, but this is our overall method. And you see the same diagram I showed you before for the fluidized bed, right? We learn from nature to solve a problem in fuel cells where we can draw higher current density. We learn from the fractal structure of the lungs, but also the uniform structure at the cellular level. And so here we do two things. We construct a catalyst, which I didn't talk much about here, and we construct these flow plates with the fractal structure. And that's how we implement that. Now, at this moment, this works very well. And so we had a paper in Energy Environmental Science discussing this work, and it's got quite a bit of attention. But we have been able to modify this design by using now printed circuit boards to make this cheaper and lighter, right? Remember, the technology advances, and so we can learn from new technologies to make new designs and to improve of them. That's typical in design, right? You iterate these designs. And so this is Sassang's work. And in this case, he has used printed circuit boards, one on top of the other. And similarly, with X-ray microtomography, you can see the same type of fractal structures. You can look through them to these lung-inspired fuel cells. So very nice hierarchical structure with very similar results as we had before. So what's interesting is in the course of Nature-Inspired Chemical Engineering, as students, you would do the same thing. So you would actually work in teams and you would say, I'm interested in a problem on batteries, or I'm interested in a problem related to new drug design, or problem in fouling in pipelines. What lessons can I learn from nature? Are there mechanistic principles like these hierarchical transport networks I can learn from? How do I move from the concept to the design to the implementation? And at the end, the students present their projects in the last class in presentations, oral presentations. But in the meantime, there's various milestones and of course discussion sessions, and you don't just get classes. We discuss with the different teams, and so and you end up writing even a report. In the end, that's like a grant proposal, right, to the center of how you would carry out research to move this forward. So I find it as exciting as I think that the students do. So here you see how we implemented and used these various scales. The nanoscale, the mesoscale, the macroscale, all of them is important. I didn't talk so much about the nanoscale, but there's a lot to be learned from the structure also of enzymes and structures, and some of them and how they can very selectively convert certain chemicals and desired chemicals, also in electrocatalysis, right? There are so-called metalloenzymes we can learn from. And so all these scales matter. And this is a paper we just wrote with my postdoc Panos Trogalas. And so which discusses this in more detail. So I already showed you that somewhere, some of the results were a little below one had in the of computations. And so we were wondering what's going on. So when we looked at this fractal structure, when the channels are very narrow, well, the problem is hydrogen and oxygen, so it makes water, right? And the water needs to be removed. Now, so we shouldn't do biomimicry. We shouldn't just copy nature entirely. And so in the lung, of course, if you had water, it'd be in trouble. And so with neutron radiography, we're able to visualize what's happening with the water that's formed in one of these cells. So you can go to a synchrotron. And so this was work of Jason, a former a PhD student in the group. And he looked at the water formation and how it's moving through. And you see that the potential in this fuel cell drops dramatically as a result of water that is formed and it's clogging some of the channels. And then when whoop, it's blown out and the potential goes up again. So indeed, it is the water that is clogging some of these finest channels. So maybe we can learn lessons from nature again, right? And so that's what we've been doing. And we've learned lessons from another principle about force balancing. not quite at the nanoscale, but at the micro scale, because it's at that scale that problems are occurring. It is at the scale of a number of micrometers to millimeters where the water is actually condensing. And so we could draw lessons from this little critter. So this is a so-called...
The thorny devil has a unique way of collecting water.
Right? So I hope you hear this. This is a thorny devil, right? It lives in the deserts. And when it finds little puddles of water, mud, it can actually, through capillary forces, it will suck up the water along its skin, and it will move alongside it, along all these different spikes. And you see how it moves to its eye, right? And then into its mouth. So the principles you can learn from this is that this creature is able to get in the arid desert, wherever it finds some water out of mud, through passive transport alongside its skins, thanks to the geometrical structure of these spikes, right? And capillary phenomena along it, it can channel the water passively towards its mouth. And so it's these principles, these forces that we are using of capillary action, right? And so this is aided by the geometrical structure, but also the hydrophilicity, so the water-loving capacity of these scales. And that's what we implemented. So that's what Jason did. And he made, by mechanical milling, some specific structures on the surface of these flow plates of this fuel cell, which you see here. And so here you see another example where he implemented this. And you see here, when you spray water on that, all the water gets sucked in as if it's a miracle. But this is just through capillary forces. So you can remove the water that's formed as soon as it's formed and suck it out. And you could combine this with these hierarchical properties of the fuel cell. That's a picture of Jason. It shows how far we go. So Jason has gone on after his PhD. He stayed on for a year, and he built also this prototype of a disability vehicle in front here of UCL, the Portico, which you also see behind me here, where he combined a battery with a fuel cell stack and integrated them. And in this way, you can have a much further drive, because the fear of disabled people is that suddenly it doesn't move anymore. But on the other hand, they need to, and then you need to recharge it, that it would need to move far enough. And just by combining the properties of fuel cells and batteries, you can go much further, and you can also have a much better acceleration and move on. So this is kind of shows how we move all the way to applications. Now, thinking about lateral thinking, this is another student in our group, Marika Schmitz. She's a PhD student in our group, and she's an architect by training. Now, the Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering has people in it who are chemical engineers, of course, but also material scientists, chemists, physicists, medical discipline, architecture, and so forth. So we work across many faculties and disciplines at UCL, across disciplinary borders. That's how you solve challenging problems. So what Malika is doing, so she's trained as an architect in the Bauhaus. She's doing a PhD in chemical engineering with myself and a colleague, Marcos Cruz, in the Bartlett, in the architecture school. And so she was saying, well, if you have the problem with walls and the built environment is a control of humidity, but also fouling, and you would like to have various properties combined. And in nature, there's a lot to learn, but nature is also quite interesting in the ability to be multifunctional, to address several problems at the same time. And so here, what Malika has been doing is to learn, in the one hand, from cicada wings, which are the wings of these insects, which can repel bacteria and water by a pillared structure at a micrometer level. So you have all these nice pillars, one next to the other, and the water can just slide off, and the bacteria as well. Now, at the same time, moth eyes also have a pillared structure, but a cone structure, and the human eyes, inverted cones. And the moth can therefore see in the dark, while the human eye can focus light. So Malika combined these different structures in this nature-inspired approach to conceptualize these pillared structures and design, right? So you see the nature-inspired engineering approach here, to design these coatings that you see here on the right, which are made by a 3D nano printer. So this printer can print with a resolution down to 100 nanometers out of polymers. So they're both very beautiful structure, but also very functional. They can actually channel the light, they can channel the water through this capillary action, right? So we can learn from our other project and integrate this all. And so here you see this beauty of these structures, these bottle-like structures, right? And so they're very beautiful. They've also been exhibited, actually, in the Centre Pompidou recently. And so you see also how light, when it interacts with these structures, it can really make it, channel the light as well, and focus the light. So they are really multifunctional. And so this was exhibited last year in an exhibit in the famous Centre Pompidou in Paris, this image. And you see here a droplet of water and how it's channeled through this. So what was also especially interesting is that using these ideas, okay, this 3D nanoprinter, it's quite expensive still to make, and not everybody has such equipment. Now, these are smaller scales that you can only make, right, at this point. And it would be quite expensive to do this now and use these, say, on wall panels, on window panels. But bringing water to space is something else. The International Space Station requires water to be brought there because only 70% to 90% of the water can be recycled in space. And so the idea was then, and so this is being evolved in collaboration with the European Space Agency, who got interested by this, is to use coatings using these type of materials, maybe on ventilation shafts, and use it for the International Space Station. So where more of the water could be channeled, perhaps bacteria could be repelled, they're polymeric, so it might be anti-radiation as well. So you see how we could use this for an application that's used in space. You might say, well, you know, bring the water to space. Well, it's very expensive. Actually, it costs several tens of millions of dollars every year to bring water to space, right? And so if you think about more the space technology, you see all the fact of even going to, you know, private space missions and bringing people to space and having moon bases and what's so forth. You can't do this if you don't have water and your protection against radiation. So perhaps these materials might help do this. So you see how by working across disciplines, bringing people in who think across disciplines, but use this nature-inspired chemical engineering and solutions for engineering approach, we can address a large number of problems, right? So another example here is on membranes. I know some of you, or there were some questions last time about can we apply this for membranes and water? Well, yes, you can go down even from this microscale to nanoscale. And so this is an example here of a cell membrane. And so in the cell membrane, you have these so-called aquaporins, which can channel water through, but repel protons. So they're ideal for water desalination. That's what our cells do all the time. And they do this by these very narrow channels, which can channel one molecule of water through at a time, but pull each other through to the water dipole moment. 3 billion molecules per second through each channel. That's only like a molecule of water wide. How can it also do this? Well, it has an electrical force in it. So there is a positive charge in the center, negative charge on the outside. So you get an electrical field that's repelling cations. So you also get the separation mechanism. And so this principle, if we were to apply it for water desalination, purification, literally clean buckets of water per minute, okay? And so to molecular simulations, you can understand these principles, but what Silo Mioto, former PhD student, did is then to use this, right? And I can't go in the details because of time, but conceptualize this principle from nature and build materials with controlled nanopores, right? Just like the pores you have in these catalytic materials. So nanopores, and functionalize them, put different groups on them in the inside, on the outside, to have selective transport through them, right? So that is actually the goal. I put a question mark there because the way of making these materials still would be too expensive. And so this should iterate. You first have to test the principle, right? And then you can, by new materials insights and production, you can make this cheaper and more approachable. And so some exciting work carried out by current PhD student Hanan Mohammed and former postdoc Jerome Meng, who's now an associate professor in Donghua University in China. There we are learning lessons from the kidney, also for water and for protein separation. Now the kidneys are amazing, right? They filter 180 liters of urine from our plasma every day, and they use a very small pressure drop. And that's all you do in these nephrons. You can zoom in and you find this glomerular complex. And this complex has a lining. So it has these windows on it, but also a lining of sugar-like molecules called the glycocalyx. And so this structure, this brush-like structure, is apparently able to repel also dirt, so proteins and fouling, and so everything that shouldn't be filtered out, so that otherwise you would lose the proteins. And it does this without clogging. Now, this is really important because protein separation in industry and also water purification is very much hampered by so-called fouling, right? And clogging of these membranes. That's one of the biggest challenges. So we could learn from the kidneys that have to do this over a lifetime. And so there are various concepts we are exploring. And so one that Alan is exploring here is with brushes. So using these principles, not use all the complications of nature, build all the difficulties. There's a very complex organ, but learning from the mechanism. And it may be chemical parts, there may be geometrical parts that play a role, even the fluid mechanics of the flow. Using these concepts to design new membranes that use this, for example, by polymer brushes. Right? Another postdoc, Jenna and Lee, this brand new work that we're in the course of publishing, is looking at cell membranes. So on the cell membranes, you also have these layers on them that are able to repel pollutants, and the hydration layer in them is very, very important. And so they can in this way repel also E. coli. And so we use this in a design to use chitosan polydopamine layers on a conventional polymer. And in this way, we are able to have much better properties for use in drinking water and wastewater treatment. Okay, so these are some examples. So I'll quickly show maybe the third one on dynamic cell organization very rapidly here. And if there are questions, I can show a little bit more on this. So these patterns that I showed on continuous perturbation are all due to continuous perturbation, due to the action of wind or water. You even see this in a cup of tea, right? That you have these patterns, so-called Faraday waves that form them. There's similar physics behind them, right? And we implemented this use of physics by oscillating the gas flow to a fluidized bed. So instead of using that fractal structure, we oscillate the flow of the gas now. And from a completely chaotic structure of bubbles, we get these beautiful regular bubbles going up in the bed. And they're all nicely separated. So it's very similar to the patterns you see on the sand. So use dynamics, use systems far from equilibrium, like in nature, to get structures and regularity, right? You can do this in 2D. These are experiments in a lab. In 3D from the top, you have these beautiful, this is slow down, the high-speed camera, so it's slow down images where you see these beautiful square patterns, even though it's circular. So these are not classical linear standing waves. These are non-linear waves leading to regular patterns. And so this is the same idea of learning lessons from nature, conceptualize, design, and implement. And this is with the team shown here. Kai-Chia Wu is in our group. So he just recently got his PhD, and former postdocs Linda Martin and Victor Francia. So when you oscillate the gas flow in a fluidized bed like this, and you have these problems of caking and blocking because powders are cohesive, you oscillate it, you can much more easily also mix the contents. So kind of wanted to show you a few of these examples here. I will kind of stop here and give you my final slide to actually show you that I've kind of to illustrate the overall methodology of nature-inspired chemical engineering, which is taught in the class and you can practice as students. And I've shown you a few flagship projects, learning from these hierarchical transport networks for bio-inspired fuel cells, nano-confinement effects. In fact, on this slide, there's another example in catalysis. I illustrated it for fuel cells, for membranes, for coatings, and then learning from nature-inspired structuring of dynamics, even not living systems like the dunes. What can you learn from them to pattern, structure fluidized beds, and even in this way, when you want to mix some particles that you want to dry or you want to coat, to do this much more effectively. And the final one is on ecosystems, which I haven't discussed today on resilience, but if there are questions about this, happy to show something. We're doing some examples related to cancer immunotherapy, for example, related to learning from systems in nature. And so finally, I want to show this slide. I mean, normally, you know, when I'm walking to work, I go by this building called the Darwin building, and it inspires me as well, because of course, Darwin has, you know, through his book, The Origin of Species, has shown us through evolution of how you can get these, how from very simple origins, you can very, very complex organism. But we should also never take a dogmatic approach. Things may not be necessarily optimal. Things continue to evolve, and they may not necessarily be optimal for an engineering application. So to inform the design of sustainable solutions, we should, and we can learn so much from nature, but we need to think about the context also of society and the environment to be able to implement that. So you have to combine both these visions, right? So I like to normally to travel as well. There's an image in Costa Rica, and you see these turtles coming to the beach. There's so much to learn, things that we don't understand. I mean, these turtles started doing this on this particular beach only in the 1950s. and to lay all their eggs at a very particular time of the moon. And you say, by the way, they're social distancing here, so they're doing quite properly. And now there must be less humans, so I'm sure they're doing very well. So this is kind of an overview of what we do in the NICE course. I started it together with a colleague from Cooper Union when he visited on sabbatical, Daniel Lepek, in 2015, and now teaching it together with Dr. Yang Lan, a lecturer in our department. And so we've had quite a few students taking this course. So I look forward to seeing some of you in person when you are in this course. And this is a picture of our group last summer in the London Wetlands Centre, getting inspired by nature. And if you want to see more and read more, go to our website on the CNIE, and you can read our latest brochure there. You're available to view it there on the website. And you can follow us on social media as well. So I'll stop here, and I'll check if you have any questions. Please go ahead. Thank you very much. So I had a first question here, which is not directly related to the class itself, but I'm sure it's all on your mind. And I was thinking someone will actually ask this lecture when I saw the news here today. Clearly, we're living in very unusual times, difficult times. The news, I mean, factors are changing constantly. And all our lectures have been delivered last term in online. And so we've had to adapt, just like most universities in the world. And the policy of the university has been also to be proactive and to make sure that we would be prepared for online lectures also for the next academic year. I know I've only just seen this announcement this morning in Cambridge for the whole academic year to put things online. It may well be. I'm not privy to new details around it, but frankly, it could make sense that a lot of the lectures will be online, if not all. And the priority for UCL, as it must be, is health and safety. We must make sure that our students, and of course the staff, can be and get the education in a safe environment. If that means that we do things online, then we will continue to do this. The way things are looking now, and the fact that we don't want to take those risks, makes it more and more likely, and I would expect some news to come on this, that lectures will be delivered online. But I can't give an official answer in all sincerity about this, because I'm sure there's a lot of thinking goes around it. We love to interact with our students. We love to interact with them in person when we can. We understand the importance of practice, also in labs. We miss that ourselves, both in research and in teaching. But we will look at every possible alternative when this time comes to do it further online, like we have had last term, but even better, because we will be better prepared. And we're all very committed to be able to deliver an online curriculum that is meaningful to our students. So I think this will be something we will have to look in, and it may be very possible that this will happen. Sure, are there other questions? Any of our participants? Related to the lecture or other things? I see that there's still a good number of you online. So please feel free to go ahead. Last time we had a lot of questions that we continued for quite a while. Anything I can answer, I will. Yeah, so I'm going to wait one more minute, but don't be shy to put it on there. But if there are more questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And you're also free, clearly, to contact me. These lectures will also appear on our YouTube channel. So I get a question here: how important is nature-inspired chemical engineering in innovation? I would argue that it is really important. I mean, this is the core, actually, target of it. I mean, the way I started off was on discussing the grand challenges we have. And in some way, to address these grand challenges, we need really to think outside of the box. We need to think completely different. And that's what innovation is all about. Innovation is also to try to see something that also can be implemented in practice, of course. And so you need a method, because it's easy enough to say, oh, we have this problem, so how are we going to address it? So thinking about issues in nature, which had to evolve to address some very challenging environments, it may lead us to a lot of innovation, right? So I had these, you see if I can get this back here, an example here of innovation that we've had in the center. So these are all examples from innovation from the center. So one example is, I mean, you see here on the left, a picture actually with our provost and our vice provost for enterprise. This is a picture of Niall Kent. And Niall Kent is a former postdoc, is now honorary lecturer. And so he had a background related to dental materials. And so Niall, when he joined my group and our center, we thought of a way of thinking about an issue which you have with when people lose a tooth, right? And you need a graft, you need a dental bone graft substitute material that you need to put in the cavity in order to be able to put in the graft, the false tooth, right? And so these materials, they need to be fed as well. So we need to think about the structure of bone, the hierarchical structure, how nutrients can get there and how it can grow and integrate with the rest of the bone. And so we invented a new material, which we call aerograft, which does exactly that. And so, and for this, we are actually commercializing it through UCL Business. I mean, several awards were won for this from the Royal Academy of Engineering, Launchpad Award a couple of years ago. And last year, the UCL Innovation Enterprise Award, Early Career Award for Niall Kent. And so this material got the interest of some larger companies as well. And so it's an example of learning from what we saw, not just from nature, structure of bone, but how we implemented it for porous catalyst, their design, the hierarchical structure you have in this, to design a hierarchical porous materials that would integrate very well with the surrounding bone. And it performs much better than existing materials that are out there in the market now. So this is something where we are advancing it and where a lot of innovation was clearly possible. We have other examples here. I showed you the example of Jason with the disability vehicle and the work we're now doing with European Space Agency. In fact, there are some parabolic flights where we hope to take our materials up for coating and to test them. So that's an example of clear innovation. And then another one that's actually very timely is a microfluidic platform developed by former PhD student Matthew Chin, and together with colleagues in medicine, the group of Richard Day, to actually learn from the immune system itself for immunotherapy for cancers, right? And he developed and designed and built this microfluidic platform through which you can use chemical engineering principles to create these adoptive T cells. So T cells from the body, which could attack and it could be used in our immune response to actually modify them by a controlled structure where we learn from the way that cells behave in different environments. So when you put a cell in a different environment, they can move and can evolve in a different direction. So for example, that's well known with stem cells that they can grow and transform into a skin cell or a muscle cell, a heart cell, and so forth. So here you can actually, by having a proper hydrogel that we could activate, we can actually control and modify these T cells that could then be injected back in the body. So that's another example. You see the breadth of the number of areas we could go into. And maybe some lessons from this might actually be able to be learned for diagnostics, therapeutics, when you think actually about our current crisis. We can't just move too much ahead of ourselves, but these are possibilities. I see that once there was one question, there are many more. There was one on solid byproducts removed from microscopic pores in catalysts. So indeed, that's called catalyst deactivation. In a porous catalyst, you may have solid particles that are actually deposited in there, for example, coke, right? And what we can do is we can mitigate this effect by having these better transport. So if you have a better connectivity, it's just like when you have traffic jams. If you have a better connectivity of roads, you could go around, right? And so our body does that. And there are bypasses and ways to go around. And so and by this improved transport across length scales in porous catalyst, we are able to circumvent and to avoid not just the formation of solids, but also even if there's some blockage, there are alternative pathways. And so we've used that to design and create new porous catalysts that are much more resistant, right? So that's a great question. And so that is indeed something, and the formation itself of the solid byproduct is also something one might learn. I mean, think about the example of the kidney. There's a lot to be learned. So maybe this can also be prevented by learning lessons from nature, right? So another one was about how effective the nice approach would be if we are taking concepts from something that's very similar, like electric eels and energy storage. I love those creative ideas that come up. And that's what I love when I teach the nice course as well. Every time the projects are different and students get ideas from different mechanisms. So an electric eel, right? Unusual. So what can you learn from that? What can you learn from this for energy storage? I'm not going to give you the example, the answer here. It's not like I also have answers for everything, but perhaps we can indeed learn lessons from this organism, how that is happening, how is such a response generated? Can it be simplified to be implemented? Because as an engineer, we need to learn from the principle, but then implement it within the environment that it can be used, say at scale or in an economical way, right, in practice. So, and that will require an adaptation. So it's adopting from nature, but also adapting, right? And so, so it might be possible to do that, right? Can these researches be carried out in UCL facilities? Everything I showed was carried out at a UCL facility. They're all images from our labs, all research that's been carried out in our labs. We are lucky. I mean, we have good, we got good grants that we were able to bid for competitively. The Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering started off with one of the only 5 frontier engineering awards in the country, worth £5 million, and only 2 of them last year got additional support from EPSRC. And we have many, many industrial partners as well who are interested in approach. Also, some of our students clearly go on and use it then in practice. And so, so we have been able to build a unique facility supported by the university and by our partners. And so we also collaborate, as I said, with industry, and at some scale it can be done elsewhere as well. And we collaborate with people across the world, across every continent. And so whatever we don't do here, like a synchrotron, clearly we don't have one in our department. So, but then we have contacts and we can do such work elsewhere as well and collaborate. So the answer is yes. Are there research groups in UCL dedicated to nature-inspired engineering solutions? Well, I'm the director of the Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering. So this is a unique center. And so the answer is clearly yes. I think I answered that just now. And so if you are a student here, you will get exposed to that. And clearly we have quite a bit. I showed a picture of our PhD students and postdocs working in the center, which is becoming larger and larger. It includes now research not just in our department, but across different faculties, as I mentioned, all the way from architecture to medicine, computer sciences, engineering, life sciences. So it's very, very broad, and we interact with the social sciences as well. So, so we have unique research at UCL that has been started through this, but that's related to nature-inspired engineering solutions. And some of our final year projects, Halan's, you might remember. So I showed a picture of Halan, who was working on the kidney-inspired membranes. She was a final year undergraduate student. And Sasank, who I showed with the printed circuit boards for the fuel cells, right? He was an MSc student who took the course on nature-inspired chemical engineering. Both, continue to do PhDs in the group, right? So clearly one thing can lead to another. And so several People stay on and do PhDs as well. And so, I mean, clearly we're limited in some way of how many people we can accept, and it needs to get funding for it as well. But I'm quite excited about the students we have on our group. So as I kind of mentioned, there was a question about outside non-UCL student staff. We collaborate internationally. I always put down the names and people here. So clearly the core is at UCL in chemical engineering, but also in different departments, collaborators that I already mentioned. But we have collaborators around the world. I showed some work, for example, you know, related to hierarchical catalysts. We collaborate with researchers in China. We have visitors coming from, who stay for also master's projects and research with us from Italy, from the Netherlands, from the United States, from Belgium, from, you know, everywhere. We have collaboration in France. So we, you know, Germany is, you know, around the world really. And so across the UK, there is now a so-called knowledge transport networks, which is geared towards innovation on nature-inspired solutions. And we kind of catalyzed the start of that last year. And so this nature-inspired solutions is also having workshops and groups to discuss problems of learning from nature, to promote the use of that for designing solutions for industry. And so also this is leading to a lot of new contacts, and it's spreading basically the vision. So there's quite a bit of work. I mean, there's work that is bio-inspired or biomimetic at different places around the world, but the vision and the methodology is quite unique and has been developed here in our Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering and at UCL. And so that makes it quite special, and that's how we collaborate with people around, and we have great connections. There was a question about chemical engineering UCL syllabus. Well, it is an elective in the final year, right? So I showed how we, the last year, I think we had 65 students, fourth year chemical engineering and MSc students. It is an elective. I mean, there are a variety of electives, and you need to satisfy, of course, a relation between depth and breadth as well. But quite a few students take it to the level that we had to cap it in some ways, so that students also had to say why they wanted to take the class. We ask in advance who is interested in particular modules, and these are the modules that are available. So what are you interested in, right? And so so here there's a question about rare metal catalysts and to replace them by enzymes in the near future. Well, the example that I showed on metallo catalysis, the question can be seen in various ways, right? So you are, there is always a search to replace rare resources by something that is not rare, whether it doesn't have to be an enzyme, right? That's the key point. It can be something that is a not so rare material and that is much cheaper and much more widely available, right? If you can replace something that is, say, a platinum, and you can replace it by something that's nickel, or you can use iron instead of ruthenium, right? It's a step forward. Can you learn from enzymes? Yes, and we're learning from enzymes also to design new catalysts that either are based on enzymes or they are not enzymatic at all. They are artificial. And so to be sustainable, one doesn't necessarily have to use something from nature in a direct sense. That's one of the key points of the nature-inspired approach. It is inspired by nature. So sometimes it may make sense to use an enzyme, but sometimes the enzyme is more expensive, it would be hard to get, right? So it all depends on the application, right? Okay. So I think I'll stop here. I thank you for all the great questions. I always enjoy receiving those, and there are always new questions that come, and that's how we evolve. And so, as I said, also when I teach the class on nature-inspired chemical engineering, the final project, I always enjoy also their presentations, because they go from examples from safety to anti-fouling, and I could only show so many examples here. Right, and so feel free to contact me. You have the contact information. This will also be on YouTube of UCL Chemical Engineering, and reach out to us. And we hope to see you plentifully. Clearly, we'd love to do this in person. We will see if this is possible. Safety must go first. And I think many universities are taking those steps, and we're certainly prepared for the eventuality, right? And so information will be available. And I think Marc Bernades has actually shared also a link, and so look at the Q&A at the answered questions here. Please check the frequently asked questions for updates. We definitely will inform as soon as we can. So thank you very much. I wish you all the best. Wish all the best to you and your families in health and safety. And let's take some inspiration from nature in many ways for engineering and for our happiness. Bye-bye.